It has indeed been a big month for startups. Alex McCauley, CEO of StartupAUS, is here with me now. Now, Alex, before we chat about StartupAUS, what are your thoughts on Matt Barry's closing statements in terms of, finally, Mum's told me I don't need to go and get a job anymore? Something you must hear a lot.
I reckon this is actually a super important point for the system as a whole. I mean, kids going home, smart kids, coming out of school or uni and telling their parents, I want to go start a business instead of being a lawyer or a doctor. That's a hard conversation to have, and we need to try and make that an easier conversation to have.
I remember I met a guy called Jost Stolman. He was the CEO of a fintech company here in Australia at the time, and he was saying we need to change the mental model around how parents in particular view entrepreneurship and society at large. How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a cultural thing, right? We always talk about capital, talent and culture, and this is that really sort of intangible cultural element. There's actually a thing in the literature called vocational prestige, which is about how prestigious a particular kind of job is, and Australia ranks very poorly in terms of how we see entrepreneurship in terms of our global counterparts. So we can definitely pick it up.
Work to do.
Yeah.
Good. Alex, as I mentioned earlier, StartupAUS was born 5 years ago. A bunch of founders got together and decided the body was needed. So I suppose two questions to kick us off. Why a startup advocacy group? Why was that needed? And what's the change you've seen in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, basically it was formed because there wasn't a national narrative that included startups at the time. Startups didn't have a voice with government at all. Just after StartupAUS was formed, Tony Abbott became Prime Minister, and innovation was a sort of dirty word in the cabinet room for a little while. But of course all that changed when Malcolm Turnbull came in and there was a real uptick. But so StartupAUS really is about representing startups with government. Over the 5 years, there's been a real shift in terms of the momentum and success of the sector. Probably the most visible bit is that 5 years ago, if you're a founder in Australia, there was every chance you'd have to move to Silicon Valley if you wanted to grow a global tech business. And you wanted to do it now, because you need to raise some money, and there was no money in Australia. That's changed totally in 5 years. It's gone from about $70 million of venture capital available for founders here to $1 billion invested this year, so more than 10x.
Wow, wow. And the other, you mentioned Malcolm Turnbull. The other thing I understand StartupAUS did was quite instrumental in helping inform what became the innovation agenda under Malcolm Turnbull. Yeah,
so Malcolm Turnbull's big signature bit of policy in 2015, the National Innovation and Science Agenda, we did a lot of work with Malcolm and with Wyatt Roy and Christopher Pyne, who was the industry minister at the time, to try and get some of the things that startups had been saying for a long time on the agenda as part of that.
Wyatt did a good job, didn't he? It was a relatively short stint, but I was a huge fan of the way he went about things.
Yeah, Wyatt's great. I think he'll be back, to be honest.
Yeah, good. I hope so. Now, startups are driving a lot of the new jobs growth in Australia. What's behind that trend?
It's actually not just in Australia, it's all over the world. Young companies create just about all the jobs in developed economies. And this is something that's totally uncontroversial for economists, but not really in the national conversation. So the real big jobs growth drivers in Australia and everywhere in the developed world are high growth young companies, and really all young tech companies are those kinds of high growth tech companies that are creating jobs.
Mate, I'm hugely excited to talk to you about this week. You've released the 2018 Crossroads Report, which many people would know is the roadmap for how we build an effective Australian startup ecosystem. What have we done well so far?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really biggest things we've done well is solve this capital problem that we talked about just a second ago. If you're a founder in Australia now and you want to raise money to build a global tech business, you can do so from here with Australian investors, and actually there's a whole bunch of international investors who are looking to invest in Australian companies too. And so what that has meant is that there's a huge wave of second generation, if you like, startups. There's the startups that Matt was talking about in his piece at Freelancer, at StartCon, that were around in the sort of late .com era, and now we've got companies formed in the last 10 years that are about to seriously hit the big time, and they'll become household names. Just this year we had Canva, who became $1 billion business. I think there'll be 5 or 10 more joining Canva in the next couple of years.
It is incredibly encouraging to see. What are the challenges that still exist?
I think one of the biggest challenges at the moment actually is the political narrative around technology. Technology is a bit scary sometimes. It's disruptive, it's going to change the way we do business, and I think that puts people on the back foot a lot of the time. But I think the thing we've got to realise is it's going to do that whether or not we like it. We can't stick our head in the sand. We've got to go out and create some fantastic tech companies to really grab the value that technology brings, so that we end up as one of the disruptors, not one of the disrupted.
I'm glad you mentioned the tech phobia. What is that, and what needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think with anything that people don't quite understand, there's always a bit of fear around.
And so this tech phobia, as it relates to founders of startup businesses, there's a tech phobia?
No, I think look, to be honest, it's probably driven by a view of big tech. The big tech companies coming out of the US. There's a whole political narrative about tax, there's a political narrative about privacy, and all that stuff has actually flowed on to startups in a way that I think is potentially quite damaging for the sector if we don't get it right.
So it's not startup founders are not embracing technology, it's that there's a political and somewhat media agenda that's not all that great, not putting tech business in the right light.
Yeah, that's right. And I think on the startup side, I think, it was very sexy a few years ago to be a startup. These days, I think there's a little bit of a hint of, is this just hipsters in Surrey Hills, running businesses like this? And that's something we've absolutely got to change because, we know, we had Luke from Safety Culture on the Grab earlier. He founded his business in Townsville, and that business has now raised $100 million in venture funding and employs hundreds of Australians. So this is happening everywhere around the country. It
is incredible to see, particularly as you say, relative to 5 or 10 years ago, we have come such a long way in a really short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to be able to take a snapshot where 5 years ago there was nothing and now there's really something.
Yeah.
The really big thing we've got to do now is consolidate some of those gains. I mean, we've got a tipping point where there's these companies that are just about to make it. We've got to lock that in and really secure those wins so that we can make this a stable industry.
Alex McCauley, CEO of StartupAUS, thank you very much for joining us.